It's finally time to rip the old engine out of my car. I still have a little bit of fine tuning to do on that one and another one, but it's currently raining and I need to test drive both of those, so that's not happening. So I figured I'd take the time to start ripping this thing apart. Now, for those of you who don't know, the engine that's currently in it right now is just a Bitsa engine. It was the engine that I took out of my V8 project that I knew nothing about, which ended up having a wiped cam in it. I stuffed the only cam I could find laying around in my used engine piles of partially disassembled engines that wasn't wiped and the lifters looked good on, and I threw my cylinder head and oil pan on it from my old engine. So in order to finish up my new engine back there, I need to get the cylinder head off and a couple other small bits and pieces to put on that engine. In addition to putting the new engine in, we got a few other things we're going to do to the car while it's in here. And one of those things is I want to check the ride height and make sure that the springs haven't actually settled and it hasn't changed from when I had it set up autocrossing last time. So before I lift it up, since I drove it in and it settled on its springs, I am going to check the ride height at all four corners of the pinch welds. And I've already gone around and checked the tire pressures to make sure they were all even and not too low to change my measurements. So I do have notes on the ride height as it was measured before and also the weights all the way around. So what we do is we're just going to check this from here, from the floor to the pinch weld all the way around and see what that dimension is. And then compare that to the notes from before. So I'll get the other three measured and take a look. So checking with my notes, I was actually worried that the rear springs were sagged, but it seems actually the front has actually sagged a little bit, where the rear is actually still pretty close. So that's something that we're going to be addressing after the engine's back in it. Let's get this thing up in the air and start getting it ready to pull the engine out. So after measuring the ride height and then getting under and taking the exhaust system off, I now can see why I was actually scraping a little bit in some areas on the exhaust system because the front end had sagged down just enough. I was catching this front clamp occasionally on a hump in the road right down the road here. And my rear hanger had pretty much come completely disconnected, so that's why it was rattling at the back within the hole. I thought I was going to have to modify the hole and make a whole new hanger, which I'm going to go ahead and do a new hanger anyway to make sure it stays together and is held in there, because I just had a cheap universal thing on there. I went ahead and drained the gearbox as well as the coolant. And that's because that is the Datsun 280Z 5-speed. So it's got a slip yoke on the back. So when we go to pull this up out of here, it's going to drain out the back of the transmission all over the place if you don't drain it first. Plus, I had rebuilt this transmission and it was the first transmission I had ever rebuilt, and I wanted to see what kind of nastiness might be in the oil. So the gearbox has felt just fine, but was slightly noisy from a chipped tooth that I noticed in one of the gears. But yeah, that's a lot of silver there, so I might want to at least consider splitting the transmission and taking a look inside. So one of the really easy things to forget to do when you start pulling an engine is to take the shifter out, and then when you're starting to sling the engine out of there, it doesn't want to come out because the shifter is through the hole. So it's always a good idea to go ahead and do it really early in the process, especially since once you take the transmission cross member loose and the transmission drops a little bit, it's a lot harder to reach in there and do it. I've gotten into the habit of pulling out the drive shaft before I take the shifter out, because sometimes those bolts don't want to come out all that easy, especially if it's been in the car for a while and they're a bit rusty. So it can be a lot easier to just turn the drive shaft to where you can get a hold of one of those bolts and then reach into the car, pop it into gear. Then you can take the one loose, get it out, pop it out of gear, turn it to the next, and so on and so forth. One little helpful hint of advice is before you pull an engine out, while you're draining the radiator, make sure you open up your heater control valve. Either disconnect the cable and open it up, or go inside and turn it to hot, so that the heater can drain through the radiator hose as well, and you don't have the radiator or the heater full of coolant when you go to take these lines loose. Let's go ahead and start getting some more of the stuff out. Well, that's pretty much everything on the top side except taking the bolts out of the motor mounts. I'll get those bolts loosened up here, and we'll get it up in the air and start getting the stuff from the bottom, like the wires off the starter and the transmission mounts, and I'll be ready to come out. So that's pretty much everything on the top side here except for getting the bolts out of the motor mounts. I'm going to get those out real quick, and then we can go down underneath there. I'll get the wires off the starter, get the transmission mounts and cross member out of the way, and this will be ready to pull. And then yes, that intake manifold and the header are all made by me. We'll take a closer look at them when we start putting this thing back together. Well, the old lump is out of there. Now the camera is almost out of battery, as well as my mic, so this is probably going to be it for this particular installment. Next time we'll start out with getting this transmission off, flywheel, clutch, all that stuff, cylinder head, and go from there.